Hello and welcome to The Daily Oz. I'm Emma Gillespie.
I'm Zara Seidler.
Australia's most listened to radio show has breached decency standards according to the media watchdog. The Australian Communications and Media Authority, ACMA, launched a formal investigation into the Kyle and Jackie O show last year after it received a listener complaint in June. It has now found segments of the show, hosted by Kyle Sandilands and Jackie O Henderson, quote, would be considered offensive to any reasonable person listening to the broadcast. Today, we are going to unpack everything you need to know about this investigation, where it came from, what it found, and what it means for this very popular breakfast radio duo.
When I think of Kyle and Jackie O, I think of this like omnipresent presence. When I went to school, on the radio every single day, you know, always being talked about among kids in the schoolyard, that sort of thing. But I recognise, of course, that I grew up in Sydney and that Kyle and Jackie O had this real stronghold over Sydney. But if you grew up in other parts of the country, that wasn't necessarily the case. So for listeners who haven't grown up with them in the car or on the bus, what do people need to know about Kyle and Jackie O and I guess their presence in the Australian radio media scene?
Yeah, I think even if you aren't in Sydney where they've broadcast for so many years, you're probably familiar with Kyle and Jackie O through the lens of controversies, through the lens of headlines. Yeah. They do broadcast in Melbourne now. We're going to get a little bit into that, exactly. But before we dive in, I do think it's important to understand the scale of Kyle and Jackie O, the scale of this show. It's a commercial radio breakfast show hosted by Kyle, who is now 53, Jackie is 50, and they are on the KISS network every morning. Now, as you mentioned, Zara, they are a mainstay of Sydney radio. They've been working together since 2000 and they've pretty much broken...
No wonder it feels like they've been at every point of my life because they literally have been.
We have grown up with them. They've been on air for 25 years this year and they've broken pretty much every record there is to break in Australian radio. They're the most listened to show in the country. They are the highest paid media personalities in Australia, above any television presenter ever. In November 2023, they signed a 10-year deal reportedly worth $200 million, securing their place not only on Sydney's KISS until 2034, but also expanding their reach to include Melbourne. Now, this is a really important part of the story because Melbourne is where this complaint that ACMA investigated actually came from.
Okay, so let's deal with the Melbourne part first and then with the ACMA complaint second. So we mentioned earlier, it's fairly recent that Kyle and Jackie O have been exported as such to Melbourne because they're Sydney-based, they record from Sydney. What do we need to know about why they have launched in Melbourne and what it's been like in that market?
Yeah, so it's part of this broader plan to nationally syndicate the show, to bring it to broader audiences. And that's something that Kyle and Jackie O have been honest about with kind of their ambitions, that they want to take the show to more cities. So KISS in Melbourne already had a breakfast show when this deal was announced. That was the Jason Lauren show, and it was axed from the network after 2.5 years on air. Now, there was a fair bit of backlash in Melbourne to that announcement at the time. Nova, a commercial station, eventually signed Jace and Lauren in Melbourne, and since then, they've actually grown their audience really significantly.
Jason Lauren,
exactly. With Nova, while Kyle and Jackie O have really struggled in Melbourne. The first radio ratings of 2025 dropped last week, and that gave us the kind of first taste this year of how all the radio networks and programs are performing. Now, the Kyle and Jackie O show in Melbourne ranked 6th amongst the commercial stations and 8th overall for breakfast. Nova, at the same time, which recruited Jason Lauren from KISS, has literally double the share that KISS does in Melbourne for breakfast. So that's the 5:30 to 9 a.m. slot.
There's so much to be said just on this topic alone. And, you know, there are many reasons being put forward as to why Kyle and Jackie O haven't flourished perhaps as much as they were expected to. Also important to note, it's still fairly early days, so their fortunes could still shift there in the Melbourne market. I know my partner, who's a Melburnian, and I have fought about this on many an occasion. We won't get into that. I do just want to compare, though, the Melbourne versus Sydney thing. Clearly, Kyle and Jackie O are massive in Sydney. Can you just paint the picture as to how massive they are?
So while we know that this is a show that is struggling to secure that audience in Melbourne just yet, it's such a different story here in Sydney. Kyle and Jackie O lead the commercial breakfast radio ratings by a significant margin. So, for example, In the latest survey that was dropped last week, KISS has a 13.3% share of breakfast radio listeners. Its closest competitor is Gold, owned by the same network, ARN, on 8.9%. And Kyle and Jackie O have won something like the last 50 radio surveys, as they're called radio surveys, in a row. So for 50 surveys back to back to back to back, they have dominated, they have secured that top spot, they have smashed every record, they have the biggest share.
So the reason that we are talking about Kyle and Jackie O today is because there was a finding handed down by ACMA, the media regulator, last week. And just to set the scene as to where that finding kind of lands, can you just talk me through some of the controversies that Kyle and Jackie O have found themselves embroiled in over, as you said, the last 25 years?
Yeah, this could be its own episode talking about each of these controversies, but broadly, all you really need to know is that they typically centre around comments made by Kyle Sandilands rather than Jackie Henderson. He has been at the centre of all these kinds of accusations of insensitive content, vulgar content. We've seen advertisers withdraw their support for the show over certain controversies. And we've also had multiple standards investigations by ACMA, which have found breaches of decency standards on several occasions, including some stories that made headlines on the show about discussions around MPOX, discussions and comments about the Virgin Mary, Kyle Sandilands asking a 14-year-old about her sexual experiences. Many of these, I'm sure, will ring bells for listeners to the podcast today. But last year, it all kind of came to a head. We heard from Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young in Parliament accusing the Communications and Media Regulator, ACMA, of failing to investigate content breaches by Kyle and Jackie O. And in that context, the head of ACMA was facing questions during Senate hearings. Here's a little bit of what Hanson-Young said at the time, which I think paints its own picture.
Just a snapshot since September. Jokes about people being gay, jokes about one of the producer's Asian housemates, jokes about the sexual and racial profiles of other journalists from other stations, divisive and violent language about women and sex. It's not just vulgar, it's disgusting, it's belittling of women, it's misogynistic, it's racist, it's sexist, it's off.
This really became quite a campaign of Senator Hanson-Young's, and, she was talking about it quite a bit in Parliament. But what we did see happen was that there was actually an ACMA investigation, right?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Correct. So ACMA launched a formal investigation into the Kyle and Jackie O show after it received a listener complaint in June. Now, that related to a Melbourne listener who had filed that complaint about the content of the Kyle and Jackie O show on the 7th of June. I'm going to read you a little bit about the complaint that was made to ACMA using that listener's words. And just a heads up, there are some expletives coming up, some strong language in this complaint. So now is your chance to turn it down if you've got some young people listening with you. In the first 10 minutes, this listener said, Kyle and Jackie O mentioned, and these were their exact words, sucking cock, licking vagina, and eating each other out. This person told ACMA another segment that morning included discussions of sexual activity by listeners, such as one man's description of, quote, the smell and cleanliness of used sex toys displayed in his bedroom. So that is a snapshot of what this listener complained to ACMA about, and I suppose a snapshot of the content that appears on the show.
Yeah, okay. And so there was this investigation. Obviously, you've just talked through the nature of the complaint itself. Did we hear from KISS, which is obviously the station that Kyle and Jackie O appear on?
Yes. So KISS responded directly to ACMA in light of this investigation. It said the discussions in question were, quote, aligned with the expectations and preferences of the audience, including their contemporary attitudes to sex.
Fascinating.
Now, I think this is also really interesting because the argument or the defense that we hear from Kyle and Jackie O often is that this isn't new, this is what their audience wants, and they continue to maintain their popularity, and so they're just meeting their audience where those expectations lie.
I do think this is such a tangent, but I do think that it would be really interesting, the distinction between a radio show and a podcast being something you actively go out and seek versus turning on the car and the radio, you can be a passive listener. Like, I wonder if that would change things. I imagine it would.
Well, I think, the broadcast standards and regulations that are enforced on live radio are very different to what podcasting is subject to. Now, according to data submitted to ACMA by KISS, by the radio network, around 20% of Kyle and Jackie O listeners in Melbourne are aged 10 to 17.
Wow.
This is slightly lower in Sydney. Interestingly, 16% of the audience is in that 10 to 17 category. But KISS has defended this content, saying its core audience are, quote, broad-minded adults.
I find that surprising that 1 in 5 Melbourne listeners are underage.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to the medium of radio and that passive listening, as you mentioned. Radio, I think, is something that people listen to in more communal kind of contexts, like the school drop-off environment.
Yeah, it is really, really interesting there. So what then were the findings of the investigation?
So ACMA found the segments in question breached the commercial radio code of practice. That's that framework that commercial radio has to adhere to in its content, because they, quote, offended generally accepted standards of decency with regard to the demographic of the audience. Now, that's where that kind of young listener demo comes into play. ACMA found the discussions were, quote, lewd and explicit, sustained and vulgar, despite their light-hearted tone. ACMA didn't identify a breach of a separate standard, though, so it did investigate a potential breach, which is about a ban on programs about sex airing between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. It accepted KISS's defence that the content in question was a few minutes of a 4-hour program and that this means it wasn't a program primarily about sex airing at the wrong time.
Fascinating.
Very interesting. The head of ACMA chair Nerida O'Loughlin, said the segments would be considered offensive to any reasonable person listening to the broadcast and that they were not in line with broad community standards.
So despite ACMA finding that Kyle and Jackie O did breach these standards, Kyle and Jackie O still remain very much on air. What penalties or what sort of ramifications are there for something like this?
This is a really interesting one because the consequences of these findings pretty much have been put on hold at the moment. And that's because in addition to Friday's findings from ACMA, it's currently running 2 other investigations into the Kyle and Jackie O show. So these are continuing inquiries examining, quote, possible systemic issues with the Kyle and Jackie O show. So taking a kind of broader look at the way the show works, the content that it's regularly discussing, as opposed to the more specifics of an individual listener complaint. And basically, any penalties relating to that June show from that Melbourne listener's complaint won't be announced until all the investigations are kind of wrapped up. But to give you an idea of what might be ahead, we can look at, previous consequences that KISS and Kyle and Jackie O have faced over ACMA investigations. And that includes in 2021, there was an inquiry into comments that Kyle Sandilands had made about the Tokyo Paralympics. Those comments were found to be insensitive and disparaging, and KISS was required to hire an additional person to monitor the show's content for 2 years. I should say here that prior to that, there was one full-time censor on the desk of the show. The show is broadcast in a 60-second delay. So
yeah, this is interesting.
This is very interesting.
Do you want to just quickly explain for our listeners what that means?
Yeah, for sure. So what this means is that the Kyle and Jackie O audio that you hear on the radio, they've said that into a microphone 60 seconds earlier. Now, there is a person, a censor on a desk listening live, not in that delay, and it's their job to pick up on any potential content breaches and to then censor them from going to air.
Yeah.
So let's say something unsavory is said, they might go out of that as live listen into the delay and bleep that out at the time. They also have the capacity to dump the show, which means to take it off air for 60 seconds to kind of recalibrate if something really is risky. So now we know since 2021 there was an ACMA finding that meant there is a second person, a second safeguard performing those responsibilities. I also just really briefly, before we wrap up, Zara, wanted to touch on another element of this controversy, which has to do with a group of activists called Mad Effing Witches. You might have seen them on social media, MFW. They have been behind this boycott under the hashtag #VileKyle, and it's become a really major campaign targeting advertisers who currently support the Kyle and Jackie O Show program. The group has been extremely vocal about contacting these advertisers, sometimes multiple times a day, but at least on a weekly basis, to voice their kind of objection to these advertisers supporting the show. Kyle and Jackie O have criticised that action. In recent weeks, they made a statement on air saying that it's unfair, that it's not listeners who are taking that action, that these kind of grabs that are unsavoury are cherry-picked. We've had some other kind of media organisations weigh in. Sarah Harris on The Project spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. It is a really interesting conversation, but I think if there's anything that we should take away from this group, it's that they are not going anywhere and they seem determined in their fight against Kyle and Jackie O.
Yeah, look, so many angles here, and media talking about media is never a dry moment, but clearly these findings are significant, and what happens next is certainly something that we will keep an eye on. So thank you for explaining that, Em.
Thank you for putting up with me.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of The Daily Yaus. As I mentioned last week, we have just wrapped up our biggest month of podcasting ever, and that is thanks to you. Thank you for your support. If you want to send this episode to a friend, that is what helps us grow. So thank you in advance and have a great day.